Hi everyone, welcome to the Bio Edge.
New Zealand is a puzzling land mass in the sense that although the archipelago is quite large, there are so few indigenous land mammals in New Zealand that it seems unlikely that the sheer isolation of New Zealand can explain every aspect of this lack. There are, in fact, no fully terrestrial land mammals indigenous to the New Zealand islands. And the closest thing we have there is a couple of species of bats that have gone partly to ground and can crawl around on the Earth surface and partly go down burrows. Now, that is a significant terrestrialization of bats, but in no way does it compensate for what remains as the single most puzzling aspect of the vertebrate fauna of New Zealand, which is the lack of any kind of mammalian herbivore or mammalian omnivore in New Zealand. Now, I know that the textbooks simply ascribe this to the remarkable isolation of New Zealand, and its isolation in the modern times is quite unquestionable. But the more we look at the history of New Zealand and the opportunities in the past for colonization by mammals, the less likely it seems that the biogeographical anomaly of mammalian absence in New Zealand can be so neatly dismissed in terms of sheer geographical isolation. For a start, when New Zealand separated from the rest of Gondwana, mammals were already around, even if they were in the form of primitive lineages such as the monotremes. And also, the large birds that appear to take the place of mammals in New Zealand, such as moa, don't really explain much because they too would presumably have had to reach New Zealand in a way similar to mammals, in the sense that they would have had to have been there when New Zealand broke away from Gondwana, or they would have had to raft. And if these large birds have always been flightless, as was traditionally thought, then why would it have been easier for large birds such as moa, large flightless birds, to reach New Zealand than for flightless mammals to reach New Zealand? So there's a whole lot of strange things that don't really add up. And now it's thought in any event that moa and kiwi and other flightless birds in New Zealand actually got there by flying, because their ancestors were flying birds and they secondarily became flightless after reaching New Zealand. So the more we find out about the molecular and fossil history of New Zealand, the more puzzling it becomes, really, that birds have prevailed to the virtual exclusion of mammals. Now, here's an alternative way of looking at this. Let's assume for a second that birds and mammals had equal opportunities right from the start of the separation of New Zealand from Gondwana to colonize and to prevail in New Zealand. But what happened was that although the mammals were initially present, the mammals went extinct for ecological reasons. In other words, it was not a failure to reach these islands, but the fact that the islands became less and less suitable over time for those mammals that were present, and that eventually the terrestrial mammals of New Zealand went extinct, whereas the terrestrial birds prevailed and evolved into unique forms, such as kiwi and moa. And what makes this even more remarkable is that these large flightless birds probably colonized these islands later by flying to them. Whichever way the birds colonized New Zealand, whether they rafted onto the islands or flew there, it remains true that the birds have adapted in remarkable ways to the insular environment, whereas mammals have not. And if there is an environmental rather than historical reason for this kind of difference in the successes of the birds and the mammals, what could it possibly be? Well, one previously unexplored possibility is that the geological nature of New Zealand is fundamentally not conducive to the mammalian uh, body plan and physiological pattern, and that birds, even flightless birds, because of their fundamental form and function, may tend to have economies and adaptive proclivities that enable them better to live in that particular geological situation. Now, this is not an argument so much about an island versus a mainland. It's an argument about a certain um, combination of geological and edaphic factors that create a nutritional environment that tends to favor birds over mammals, and this includes flightless birds. Now, um, although something like a moa is flightless, it is very different from like-size herbivorous mammals in the sense that it has a more economical body design in some ways. It's bipedal, and in moa the wings are virtually absent, although that's not true for something like an ostrich. And the physiology, the lung form, the kidney form, so many aspects of bird physiology are different from mammalian physiology in a way that might possibly be more economical, where you have um, crucial shortages of certain trace elements. Now, we know that the New Zealand landscape is generally deficient in trace elements such as iodine and selenium, and possibly also cobalt, because deficiencies of these elements have manifested in livestock farming on these islands. And for example, to keep sheep in New Zealand really involves quite an artful and vigilant supplementation regime for elements like cobalt and selenium, simply because the geological regime in New Zealand tends to be deficient in those elements, despite the fertility of the islands in many other elements, such as phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, and so on. And so it's possible that these deficiencies in crucial trace elements in the original ecological situation in New Zealand were serious enough that the competitive advantage went to the birds, not because they could fly, we're talking about flightless birds, and not because they happened to have reached the islands, but simply because birds ultimately proved to be a more adaptive design for these particular conditions. Now, this may seem like a long shot because the biogeographical anomaly is so enormous, but if it's true that the environment in New Zealand is actually quite suitable for mammals, but that mammals simply didn't reach the islands, or if they reached the islands, didn't evolve in order to adapt to the islands, then we have another problem, because we have a rather damning commentary on the viability of evolutionary theory. If it's indeed true that the whole mammalian strategy failed in New Zealand for nothing but the chance contingencies of isolation and a failure to mutate appropriately, then it means that the theory of evolution loses predictive power. It means that the theoretical power of the idea of evolution is devalued, in the sense that it doesn't take that much to create extremely different outcomes. And because the theory of evolution was originally proposed as a matter of cause and effect, and because adaptation should have some predictability to it, we're left in conceptual terms here, between a rock and a hard place. We have to accept either that the theory of evolution has failed, in a sense, in explaining what's happened in New Zealand, or we have to explore adaptive possibilities that may seem rather far-fetched, when we're talking about things as subtle as trace elements. But if we don't explore those rather far-fetched adaptive possibilities, then we'll never know how predictable the theory of evolution is, because if it can be shown that birds have prevailed in New Zealand mainly for ecological reasons as opposed to the contingencies of chance, then that would strengthen the theory of evolution in the sense of making it a more solid theory in terms of cause and effect. And so even though it may seem rather a long shot, we encourage our colleagues and peers to investigate nutritional explanations for the fact that New Zealand had various bizarrely adapted terrestrial flightless birds, but no mammals in those kinds of niches. And we look forward to seeing you next time for another item here at the BioEdge. And until then, bye.